Hi everybody, good morning. This is a digital marketing conference, so that means you are going to hear a lot about data and metrics and all kinds of left brain stuff. If you're sitting in this room today, hopefully it means you're here for the right brain stuff. This is the media and entertainment portion of today's proceedings. I like to call this session Lessons from Hollywood, How Brands Can Use Storytelling to Build a Loyal Audience. I know there are other sessions that are going on at the same time. So to paraphrase the great American poet Sean Corey Carter, known to most people as Jay-Z, you could have been anywhere in the world, but you're here with me, and I appreciate that. If you don't know who I am, let me just introduce myself briefly. My name is Miguel. I have been in the media and advertising business for well over 25 years. And I've worked for a number of media companies, including MTV, CNBC, Yahoo, and most recently MediaCorp. I've also headed marketing for a couple of big name brands, Nokia, Singtel, PayPal in the last few years. So what I'm sharing with you today is basically the result of all of my knowledge accumulated over the last 25 years or so. And here's what I've learned. If you are in the media and marketing business, we are basically in the business of interruption, right? We are in the interruption business. What does that mean? It means that you've got your consumer or your target audience on the left side trying to make their way to the content that they want to consume. Favorite song on the radio, favorite TV show, news article in a newspaper, your friend's puppy photographs on Facebook, whatever is the content you're trying to consume, the role of brands and advertisers has been to get in the way, right? That means before we bring you that content you want, you got to go through this message that we are forcing upon you. And for almost 100 years, that was a fair exchange. That was okay. If you think about what radio costs to a consumer, or what public television costs to a consumer, or even the price of a newspaper compared to the value that you get out of a newspaper, it was pretty much a reasonable exchange, right? Interruption was a road tax that we as consumers were perfectly fine with paying. Now, what changed? Well, the digital media industry came along and ruined everything. Why did it ruin everything? Well, all of a sudden, consumers have come to expect something completely different. Now, consumers expect to get the content that they want, when they want it, anywhere they want it, even on whatever device they want to consume it on. So all of a sudden, the consumer has all the freedom, all the choice. And there's more than enough content out there for consumers. And all of a sudden, that means that expecting them to sit through a commercial on their way to the content they actually want, in many cases, is no longer a price that consumers are willing to pay. This is from one of the heads of creative of one of the biggest advertising agencies in the world. And even he says, most ads are annoying. If you want to avoid radio ads, there's Spotify Premium. If you're fed up of ads interrupting your favorite TV program, there's Netflix and Amazon. Consumers are increasingly becoming annoyed with all of this interruption. How do we know this is true? Well, we also know this is validated by how much ad blocking is growing. You now have over 600 million devices that have ad blockers installed, growing at a rate on average of 30% year on year. In APAC, it's 40%. And if you look at the reasons why people are using ad blockers, they specify that it is because of annoying ad formats. And even though we have now entered the digital age, many of us who are in digital marketing are still in the interruption mindset. Raise your hand if you use Facebook. Keep it up if you watch videos on Facebook. Keep it up if you have seen your 2-minute video interrupted by an ad in the middle of it. And keep your hand raised if you find that an acceptable user experience. No, it's shit, right? It's awful. It is the worst user experience. And yet, this is still accepted as acceptable currency. So why is that, right? So my challenge is this. If you were a marketer who is all about interrupting and pushing messages at your target audience, and if you're still thinking in terms of campaign-based marketing strategies, my challenge instead is to create content that genuinely interests your target audience. So instead of interrupting, you're providing them something that they're genuinely interested in, that they consume on their own, willingly. So you're not pushing messages, you're pulling them into the value of your content. And instead of being simply campaign-based, you have now got a content-based marketing strategy. And I'll come back to that a little bit later to explain what I mean. Okay, now this is not an easy thing for a lot of people, especially people who are sort of classically trained in advertising, right? But thankfully, there is an industry that we can all learn from, and that is Hollywood and the modern entertainment industry. Here's what I mean by that. There are two things that I want to focus on today. I mean, this is what you're seeing is actually a 1-hour version of what I have developed as a half-hour workshop and also a full-day workshop. But I'm going to focus on two things today, and the first part is to think of your target not just as consumers, not just as a target audience, not just as customers, people who buy your product, but as an audience. And how do you then derive loyalty from that audience? And the second thing that we need to be able to do is to master the art of storytelling. And I'll explain now what I mean by storytelling. This is a figure discovered in Germany sometime in the 14th century. It's known as to pronounce this correctly, Löwenmensch, or literally it means lion man. Okay? And it was made by our ancestors something like 40,000 years ago. Now, it doesn't mean that 40,000 years ago there were half man, half lion creatures walking around. What it actually means is that ancient man had the imagination to say, what if you had a creature that had the characteristics of both a man and an animal? What would that look like? So this, in many ways, is a symbol of what differentiates people from other animals, right? And that is, we have evolved to the point where we can now grasp the conceptual. Right? We can now talk about and think about stuff that is beyond what is physically in front of us. Monkeys, for example, who are some of our closest relatives in the animal kingdom, actually have language, right? They've developed a kind of language of their own. And why do we know this? Because scientists have studied and recorded different monkey sounds. And they've realized that there is a different monkey sound for I see an eagle versus I see a lion. And the reason they know this is because when they play back one sound, all the monkeys look up. And when they play the other sound, all the monkeys start climbing the trees. Right? So there is a use of language, a rudimentary use of language here in the animal kingdom. But it is still very much grounded on what's in front of us right now. What is the threat right now? And for people, we are talking about something well beyond that, right? We are talking about concepts. We are talking about our imagination. And in many ways, storytelling is how we convey ideas from one person to another, even from one generation to another. If you think about all of the stories that have endured for the last few thousands of years, so that we may learn lessons from our ancestors, right? So it's really storytelling that has allowed us to do that. So storytelling is very much ingrained in our DNA. And as it turns out, we've been telling the same stories over and over again through the centuries. Now, what does this mean? It means that a lot of people have done research on this subject. And I want to call attention to 3 books in particular. So the first book was by a guy named Joseph Campbell, who then did a comparative analysis of literature and fable and myth throughout thousands of years, and actually found a number of very, very common themes. Booker and Vogler then distilled that into a very, very specific flow in the way almost all stories are told. And they also get into something I'll cover in a second, which is character archetypes. it turns out that there are 7 basic plots, right? Every movie, every novel, every comic book you're ever going to read falls more or less into one of these 7 basic plots. The first is overcoming the monster, where there is an evil thing that people must band together and try to defend against. Dracula and Jaws are examples of a overcoming the monster kind of movie. The Quest is about people going to a distant land in search of something. Comedy is it about an increasingly confounding set of circumstances, usually resolving in some kind of a ridiculous climax. Much Ado About Nothing, Bridget Jones' Diary, the Donald Trump presidency, these are examples. Rags to Riches is about a hero acquiring something of value that changes his life. Cinderella, Aladdin are examples. Voyage and Return is about going to a distant land and coming back with some new knowledge, right? Goldilocks and the Three Bears, Mad Max, Fury Road. Wow, extreme examples, but yes, they fall into the same category. Tragedy is about a central character with a fatal flaw, right? So he's a person that you empathize with, and yet has one flaw that usually means their doom. In this case, Hamlet, for example, is an example, and also the Donald Trump presidency. Rebirth is about a character who then discovers something new about themselves and has a significant change by the end of the tale. Beauty and the Beast, Despicable Me are examples. And now we get into character archetypes, of which there are 8. The hero, of course, is somebody that we're most familiar with. The hero is usually the one through whom the story is told. That's the perspective that the audience is given. The hero is the one that makes all the choices as he makes his journey. Example, Wonder Woman, right? Has everybody seen Wonder Woman? Great movie. The mentor character is somebody who helps the hero by providing him some kind of a means to achieve his goal, right? Usually in classic literature, classic myth, that's a magic sword, or in this case, a magic ring. And so my example of the mentor character is Gandalf. A guardian character is usually somebody who provides obstacles for the hero, right? Usually an early set of challenges. Sometimes the guardian then, once you overcome the guardian can then transform into an ally. Has anybody seen Star Wars Rogue One? Rogue One, yeah? That's Captain Cassian Andor, if you remember in the story. Initially, his mission is to kill the father of the main character, and then he turns out to be an ally in the end. The herald is a character that shows up with a message. Usually this message is what makes the hero make a choice as to whether he's going to embark on the quest or not. My herald example is... Not enough Star Wars fans in the audience? BB-8, thank you. Shapeshifter. Shapeshifter is somebody who kind of flips back and forth from being an ally or a foe. Sometimes you don't really know where they stand. So my example for shapeshifter is Loki, good. The shadow character is the personification of evil, or the guy who is the symbol of all of the forces of antagonism against the hero. An ally character is somebody who helps the hero, right? Helps the hero along in his quest. But note that the ally character doesn't make decisions for the hero, right? The decisions at the end of the day have to be made by the hero if you, as the audience, are going to empathize with the hero and relate to him. Sometimes the role of the ally is to be tied to a chair while the hero has to go and rescue him. And finally, the trickster character is the chaos element. Very often a device we see in stories as the comedy relief in the story. And my example is Harley Quinn. Thank you. All right. Now I'm going to run a short video. This is an example of a beautiful piece of content by HP. It was done for International Women's Day. And try to see if you can spot some of the character archetypes in it.
Paro!
The wild bird is my brother. He sweetly sings to me. With faces fair, gently she... Paro.
राजकुमारी बहुत उदास थी। उसकी आंखों से आंसू टप टप करके जमीन पे गिरने लगे और हर एक आंसू एक सुंदर सा मोती बन गया। मोतियों को देखते ही
थोड़ी डिफरेंट है। दिन भर अपनी दुनिया में खोई रहती है। उसका एक कारण है। Good morning, everyone. Let me ask you a question. Who is a writer? A writer is a dreamer with a pen. Few days ago, I discovered a wonderful writer whose book captured my imagination. She is someone you all know very well. Paramita Sanyal.
That video was only about 5 minutes long, and yet judging by the emotional reaction by some people in the audience, some of you are even tearing up. Yeah, you all know who you are. I see you from here. It's enough to transport you into this world, right? Full of characters that are familiar and that you immediately recognize and empathize with. But there's also a certain method in the way the story unfolds, and that brings me to the next topic, which is the hero's journey, right? The hero's journey is the basis of the 3-act story structure, which is pretty much present in every single movie you will ever watch, okay? And the 3 acts more or less break down into this. The first part is to establish what is known as the ordinary world, right? That's the world of the hero as it stands today, before anything changes in his life. So there's always, in every good story, you have to establish, first of all, what the normal world looks like to the hero. And then usually towards the end, this is where the herald comes in. Towards the end of Act 1, this is where the herald or messenger character comes in, that then makes the hero make a choice. And the hero then chooses to go into the next part, which is the adventure world. Right? That's where he meets his set of challenges, overcomes it, all leading up to the climax, which is Act 3, which is also known as the sort of final conflict and then the return to the ordinary world, right? So there is some kind of a big resolution, usually in Act 3, followed by the part where they try and go back to the world that they left before, usually a changed person, right? Either they themselves have changed or they've actually managed to change the world for the better. Let's try Star Wars. In the beginning of Star Wars, we meet Luke Skywalker, an ordinary farm boy, lives on a farm with his aunt and uncle, hates his life, looking for adventure, meets a messenger character in the form of R2-D2, who literally has a message. Help me, Obi-Wan Kenobi, you're my only hope. He then decides to go on his, and then something happens, which in this case is the death of his aunt and uncle, which then makes him choose to go on the life of adventure, right? And he does make a choice. Even though this horrible tragedy happens to him, it is still a choice at the end of the day for Luke. What's his line? I want to go with you. I want to learn the ways of the Force and be a Jedi like my father. Right? Act 2 is where you see a whole bunch of conflicts. They go into what is known in literary terms as the belly of the beast or the lair of the dragon, right? They go to the Death Star. He recruits allies along the way. They rescue the princess. And it usually ends with this sort of very, very deep, cutting challenge for the hero. In this case, his mentor is killed, right, by the evil Darth Vader. But does he let that defeat him? No. He marshals his forces, goes back, finds new allies, returns, destroys the Death Star, and makes the world a better place. Let's take a Marvel example. Iron Man. So in the beginning of Iron Man, we see Tony Stark, billionaire playboy, enjoying pretty much a life, a normal, ordinary world life, if you're a billionaire playboy. Casinos, girls, money, etc. And then something happens to him, which is that he gets kidnapped by terrorists. He meets a mentor character who then gives him something, right? In this case, it's a conscience. And then he decides that he is going to go and rescue himself, become Iron Man. As the story unfolds, there are more challenges along the way, more villains to overcome. There's a final confrontation with the big bad, the Ironmonger. And then in Act 3, he becomes a better man, right? I am Iron Man. He decides to become the hero. instead of just this selfless, arrogant guy at the beginning. And so on. Young boy is born to humble beginnings, son of a carpenter. He is then called on to action to live the life of the divine by the Holy Spirit, recruits allies along the way, has a number of obstacles, is persecuted by the Romans, finally chooses to die a hero's death, and literally makes the world a better place. I always need to caveat this when I use this example because I don't want any pitchforks coming at me when I leave the room. I'm not suggesting that Jesus was a fictional character. I'm merely pointing out that it is interesting that in the way we document his life, it still follows this hero's journey structure. Now, if you think back to the HP example, the brand was very visible, right? Now, did you feel at any moment that despite the visibility of the brand, did you at any point sit there and go, product placement? No, right? And that's because I think the reason that works is because the brand knows what its role is in the story. So my question is the brand the hero of the story? Should the brand be the hero of the story? Well, if you're coming from advertising, the answer is yes, right? Because advertising, in the interruption model, we know that the brand has to be the hero of the story. That's why we use words like the number one, the largest selling, the leading, etc., right? But in the world of content, that's not necessarily how it should be told. The hero is the main character. He's the one through whom the audience must relate. He's held back by the ordinary world. He embarks on the journey. He overcomes the challenges usually by changing himself, usually a better person by the end of the tale. None of those things are the brand, right? None of those things describe the brand. And that's because I think that the hero should be the audience. And what I mean by that is that you as the audience have to be able to relate to the hero and follow the hero and go, whatever emotion the hero feels, you as the audience feel as well. That's the way to tell a story properly. And if you think about every bad movie you've ever watched, the reason why it sucks is usually because the movie failed to get you to empathize with the hero character, right? Failed to get you to root for him, no matter what. I think the brand should actually be the mentor. And if you think about the mentor's role is the one that gives the hero the magic elixir, the magic sword, the thing that makes the hero succeed, and yet doesn't make decisions for the hero. The hero makes all the decisions, right? But it's also thanks to the mentor that the hero is able to succeed. I'll give you one very recent example of a great piece of content where the brand is not the hero. And it's a kind of a surprising example considering who the brand is.
If people say your dreams are crazy, if they laugh at what you think you can do, good. Stay that way. Because what non-believers fail to understand is that calling a dream crazy is not an insult. It's a compliment. Don't try to be the fastest runner in your school or the fastest in the world. Be the fastest ever. Don't picture yourself wearing OBJ's jersey. Picture OBJ wearing yours. Don't settle for homecoming queen or linebacker. Do both. Lose 120 pounds and become an Ironman after beating a brain tumor. Don't believe you have to be like anybody to be somebody. If you're born a refugee, don't let it stop you from playing soccer for the national team at age 16. Don't become the best basketball player on the planet. Be bigger than basketball. Believe in something, even if it means sacrificing everything. When they talk about the greatest team in the history of the sport, make sure it's your team. If you have only one hand, don't just watch football, play it at the highest level. And if you're a girl from Compton, don't just become a tennis player. Become the greatest athlete ever. Yeah, that's more like it. So don't ask if your dreams are crazy. Ask if they're crazy enough.
So that's a very recent ad that just came out I think a couple of weeks ago, and I loved it because it kind of it falls very neatly within what I'm talking about. So it's like kind of a gift for somebody like me, but it's great because again at the end of the day, you know, the Nike is not the hero in this ad. Neither is Colin Kaepernick. It's you, right? You're the one that sits there feeling, yeah, I can be that kid. I relate to that, right? There's something in that I personally relate to. And that's what I always say, that when it comes to branded content or content created by brands, the brand has to remember that the brand isn't the hero. The hero has to be the audience at the end of the day. The audience has to feel like they're the one going through the set of challenges along with the hero of the story. And let me now go on to the second aspect. So that's the bit where I was talking about storytelling, and obviously it has a little bit more of a cinematic kind of bent. But let me talk about the next thing, and that is learning from Hollywood and other media companies in the way that they know how to build an audience and create a loyal audience. And at the end of the day, it always has to start with the audience, right? The brand always has to think in terms of what does the audience want? What are they really looking for? If you remember that diagram from the beginning, like what is that content they're trying to get to in the first place, right? What is the thing that they actually want? So it always has to begin with the audience and what you believe the audience genuinely wants in the end. I talked earlier about the difference between a content versus a campaign-based marketing strategy. The blue line represents what a campaign-based marketing strategy looks like. And it is usually highly dependent on media spend. And these spikes represent, you know, that part where you're spending the most advertising budget, right? And usually what happens is if you're only doing, you know, kind of traditional or even traditional, what I call traditional digital advertising, you're only reaching your audience here at these peaks. And each time you hit one of these spending peaks, you're practically paying all over again to reach the same audience, right? To reach the same guys that you reached in the earlier peaks. What you're doing in a content-based marketing strategy is you are generating your own audience. The brand is generating its own audience, its own loyal following. So that with everything that you do, your audience is getting larger and larger, and that audience is becoming more and more loyal. And therefore, deepening the relationship that you have with that audience. Now, I mentioned Hollywood. The story goes that this handwritten piece of paper was pinned to the wall of Walt Disney's office in 1957. And it's an example of how building a loyal audience can really result in building a giant business empire. So you'll see that in the center is Disney's theatrical business, right? That's its movies, that's its films. In the 1950s, that would have been Dumbo, Snow White, Cinderella, Sleeping Beauty, etc. And because of that, on the back of their theatrical business, Disney was able to get into music, television, merchandise and licensing, publications, rides and theme parks, comic strips, etc. So in other words, because they built a loyal audience at the center, meaning that you had an audience whereby anything Disney, these guys would go and watch, right? Because they knew what to expect from Disney. Never heard of Sleeping Beauty, don't know what that is, but if they're the same guys who made Snow White and Dumbo, I'm in, and I'm bringing my whole family with me. That then allows them to create all kinds of additional monetization models around that audience that they've built, and because this audience is loyal, they will pretty much be up for anything you have to offer. And if you consider that today Disney now owns Star Wars and Marvel, this is pretty much the same strategy even until today, right? Now try to think of that in a brand context. If you were that brand and you had a loyal audience at the center and all kinds of monetization models that then come out as a result. And here are some examples of brands that have succeeded in doing that. Succeeded in pretty much exceeding what the brand started out being. Red Bull, for example, has transcended being a producer of disgusting syrupy energy drinks. And they're now a sports brand, right? Specifically, they're an extreme sports brand, again, with a loyal audience. Michelin Tire Company is now the leading authority in restaurants in the world. Now, how the hell did that happen? Now, I don't know if you know the story, but the reason why Michelin started making restaurant guides is because they were trying to figure out, how do we get consumers to use up their rubber tires faster? Well, the only way for them to do that is to have them drive more. Well, if they're not driving more, why not? And they realized it's because if somebody drives from one city to another, they get to the other city and like, I don't know where to eat, I don't know which hotel to stay in, I don't know where to go. And then they realized that if you gave away these guides in every city they went to, and they understood that no matter which city I drive to, there'll be a Michelin guide there for me, then all of a sudden, people are traveling the country by road, right? And that's kind of how Michelin became the kind of brand that they are today. This is a content portal run by GE called GE Reports. So they have a whole content portal around the R&D and science and technology behind GE. And if you look at the content, some of this content, rivals in quality something that you might see on Discovery Channel or Nat Geo. It's really, really excellent stuff. And the people that they have producing the content are actually journalists, right? And if you talk to the people who work there, they still consider themselves journalists, except that their beat is this giant company of several thousand people. And there is a loyal audience as well, built around all of this content that GE has created. Another great example is a huge company that you probably never heard of called Schneider Electric. Now, they are a 25 billion euro company in energy management, automation solutions, etc. Very, very specific, very niche target audience. And yet, because they've created this content carefully catering to this target audience, they have over 100 million visits per year to this portal, 4,000 pieces of online customer feedback, and there is this loyalty that's been built around the content that they put out. Let's look at a slightly more modest example. This is, if you're a Filipino, you're probably familiar with the brand Del Monte Kitchenomics. So Del Monte is a food brand in the Philippines that makes a bunch of stuff, but in particular, tomato-based products, tomato sauces, tomato paste, etc. And I became aware of this when I was working for McCann Erickson in the 1990s. Essentially content marketing before anybody had even coined the phrase content marketing. They do recipes. They put recipes, printed it on the back of the labels of their cans, and so anybody who bought a can had this free recipe that came with it. Every year, these recipes would then get compiled into a book, hundreds and hundreds of recipes, hundreds of pages, and they would sell this cookbook, and every year the cookbooks would sell out at bookstores. So imagine that. People are paying for your marketing. Consumers are paying you for marketing to them. And here's why you should care ultimately, right? I mean, I know that in marketing we are very focused on return on investment, especially short-term return on investment. But I think this is the way you need to look at the audiences that you build around your content. And that is, don't just think of them as an audience or even a target consumer, like the people who ultimately buy. You need to think of it as your pre-customer database. This is a phrase coined by two guys named Robert Rose and Joe Polizzi, who wrote a book called Killing Marketing. And that's basically what they said, right? Is that this audience, they may not be buying from you today, they may not be buying from you tomorrow or even next week, but because they have built a loyalty around your brand, they are predisposed to buy your product somewhere down the road. So you've created this loyalty, and therefore they're now more open to whatever kind of monetization ideas you might have down the road. Again, pre-customer database. And let me just play this quick video for you. This is about a company in the US called John Deere. They make tractors and plows. If you can think of a more boring category than that. But it is about how they have managed to build a content platform around this, again, very niche target audience.
While not the oldest example in the world, my favorite example is probably John Deere's The Furrow magazine.
My name's Bart. I'm 37 years old. I've lived on this farm my entire life. I can remember being 5, 6 years old. We were dairy farmers at that time and bucket feeding calves, bottle feeding calves. That's how we started. I bought this farm from my dad. He's the second generation, about 10 years ago. And we raise corn, soybeans, and wheat, and we also raise beef livestock. I'd say I've been getting the furrow and reading the furrow for about 5 years now. I will say that I think the articles in the furrow are very neutral. I mean, to the point that I always wondered, is this a John Deere magazine or not?
The furrow came along in 1895 when our company was under the direction of John Deere's son, Charles. He recognized that need for farmers to have an accurate, unbiased source of information. Anything that we think farmers can use to improve their operations, that's something that's going to make it into the furrow.
I try to key in on the soil health and soil fertility. Fertilizers have gotten very expensive through the years, and how you apply them is very important, not only economically, but also for the environment. I don't know where a company like John Deere sits on soil conservation as far as no-till versus being a more conventional type. To me, I think a company like that has more to gain when people are working more ground, but you know, the furrow doesn't just talk about that if they do it all. I mean, it's more about the opposite of that.
If you go back through the entire history of the magazine, I would be very surprised if in that editorial space you saw the words John Deere mentioned more than 15 or 20 times, and that's going back 120 years. That veil of secrecy has been lifted off of marketing. People know when they are being marketed to. The John Deere brand still stands for something. It stands for quality. It stands for honesty. That's been a critical component of not just the furrow success, but of John Deere's success overall.
Now, again, I like to talk about Hollywood storytelling, et cetera, and one of the assumptions always, one of the false assumptions that people make, especially when they talk to me about this stuff, is they say, oh, I have a really boring sector. I sell enterprise software, or I sell, whatever, widgets. I can't possibly make any interesting content. Well, I actually think it's the other way around. I think the more niche your audience, the more likely you are to be able to know exactly what they need, exactly what they want. And so it creates, if anything, more opportunities for you to create content for them, as long as you really understand your audience. And also, in my final example, I want to show you how you don't need necessarily Hollywood-level budgets. I know one of the sessions earlier was about when to bring in an agency to produce content for you, when you produce stuff in-house. And there's no simple answer, but let me just give you this example as food for thought. Let me introduce you to my friend Mark. Well, he's not really my friend. I've never met him. In fact, I've never corresponded with him. I only know him because of his YouTube channel. And Mark runs a small-sized watch dealership in the East Coast of the United States. And he sells sort of mid-range watches, sort of, a couple $100s to about maybe $1,000 watches. So not the high end of watches at all. But he has a YouTube channel and an email newsletter. As far as I can tell, this is the only marketing he does. A YouTube channel and an email newsletter. And I bought a watch from Mark a couple of months ago. It was a $1,300 watch, right? Nothing too expensive. And then I said to myself, okay, how many videos did I watch before I ended up buying a watch from Mark? And I thought it was somewhere between 40 and 50 videos. Okay, so in other words, he puts out content, maybe a video a week, sometimes 2 videos a week. And if you think about it just in terms of my example, every 40 or 50 video views, somebody buys a watch, right? And the kind of content that Mark does is he doesn't do like promotional stuff. None of it is hard sell, right? He doesn't say, this is my new watch. If you buy it within this time, you get a discount of X. No. It's about watches, right? So he talks about what is the difference between mineral crystal, hard lux crystal, and sapphire crystal. What is the difference between a radiation-based lume and a pigment-based lume? If you have a diver's watch, what is a helium valve? You know, really sort of watch nerdy stuff like that, right? Anyway, 40, 50 videos, I bought a watch. Guess how big his audience is? Mark has 62,000 subscribers and 12.5 million video views. And if you just think about it in that context, and I know it's a rough calculation and it's probably no good, but 40 to 50 videos, somebody's buying a watch, and you got 12 million video views. Just imagine what the potential is for somebody like that, because he has built this very loyal audience around his content. And if you look at if you look at how he produces it, I mean, that's it. Like, that's 90% of the video right there, right? That's like Mark in his office against a blank wall with a little piece of his window, and sometimes I can see a piece of his sofa. It's like, production budget of almost zero, right? But his enthusiasm and his genuine, and how genuine it is enough to get you hooked and getting you to come back over and over again, just because you think the content is so valuable. So I think there's a lesson there for everybody. And that's kind of where I'm going to end. An example of how content can be used to build a loyal audience around your brand. And there are storytelling techniques that we can learn from Hollywood, but more importantly, there are audience building techniques that every brand should have in order to build an audience around themselves. And again, if you look at the Long Island Watch Company example, this is an audience that he doesn't have to depend on anybody else for, right? He doesn't rent an audience from Facebook. He doesn't rent an audience from MediaCorp or somebody like that, which is basically what you're doing. If these are not really your audiences, you're just paying to access them. But here, because they're subscribing to you, they are your audience, and you can reach out to them anytime you want. And again, the formula could be something as simple as a YouTube channel and an email newsletter. Okay, thank you. I'll take some questions. I've been Miguel. You can follow me on LinkedIn, Twitter, and Instagram. Just to kind of teach myself more about content, I started my own YouTube channel a couple of months ago. So please look it up. Thank you.